He said to me, Annie, the best way to understand the power of the thermonuclear is that it's a two-stage weapon that uses an atomic bomb inside of itself as a fuse, as a triggering device. Consider that when you want to understand the power of the megaton thermonuclears.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Just out of curiosity, not necessarily related to, I guess tangentially related to the books that you've written, I'm just curious about your process as an author. And I try to ask the authors that I talk to about this. Do you come at it with a fully formulated idea? Do you come at it with a kernel and you let that grow as you water it? What's the process you go through?
Mm-hmm. And are we on the podcast?
Yes. Yeah. And we'll let the editors, they can kind of hop into this when they want to, but
okay,
I don't know. I think the listeners would want to know this. It's fascinating to me.
I'll let you, do you want to ask me again so I don't ask you that weird question if I'm on the podcast?
Sure.
Okay.
So I'm curious about your particular writing process. I'm very lucky that I get to talk to quite a few authors, and it just interests me. Some of them seem to have a fully formulated idea, and it's a skeleton that they add some muscle and tendon to. Some of them, it's like a seed they put into the ground and they water it a little bit. I know you've written very specifically in not a certain genre, but kind of looking in a certain direction a little bit. Is it something about that direction? And what gets you started? What's your inspiration for the books you've written?
Well, every book is certainly different, and I'm happy to tell you, specifics. I think they're all interesting. In a way, they are a progression. Of course, every one of my 7 books now is about the CIA, the Pentagon, or both of them. And so they weave and thread together. But I absolutely do not know the book until it's being written, because I think that may be one of the reasons why I have become a popular writer, meaning a lot of people read my books, because I relate to a lot of people, because I come to it, even though maybe you could say I'm a subject matter expert in the big picture realm of national security, I come at these really specific, highly, guarded operations and programs, not knowing the inside baseball of it all. And so I have to learn. And I personally find the learning process revelatory. Like when you go from not knowing to, oh my God, now I understand. And I hope I bring that to my books. And I think, it's not my first rodeo. I think I actually kind of do now, because that's what readers really relate to and tell me that they relate to.
Given that your subject matter is what it is, I'm curious, a personal question. As you are researching, investigating, talking to people, uncovering things, has it been difficult to maintain faith in our government, specifically the intelligence agencies nested underneath it?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So faith is a tricky word. Trust is a tricky word.
Yes.
I think you're asking me if I still believe in the goodness of the government, maybe a little bit.
That'd be definitely a fair way to phrase that. Yes.
Yeah. And that's such a great question. And I think about that often, because I too listen to a lot of podcasts. What a great medium. in addition to books and newspapers and, the idea of conversation and people discussing things really, I think, educates so many people. And I often hear in other people's podcasts or even questions that come at me like, so the CIA is, and then they'll make a platitude. And I will sometimes say, well, wait a minute, let's remember that every organization, whether it's the government, the whole of government, which I can't even see it as the whole of government. It's like, are we talking specifically about the CIA? Are we talking about the Pentagon? Are we talking about the paramilitary unit inside the CIA? Are you talking about there are these little silos and compartments of how government works. And again, I think that it's important to look at the specificity of it. But specifically, I'm going to try to answer the general question because it's a really important one, which is absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we do not have a perfect government. We do not have a perfect intel. But my God, having traveled around the world and spoken with so many different people in different countries that even, journalists who write about their countries' organizations, I think that it's pretty remarkable how the American government works, and whatever times of upheaval we're going through now is a perfect example. It kind of reminds me of the post-Vietnam era. We get through it, and we get through it by moving forward, not backwards.
Recently, whistleblowers have been called before Congress to answer a question that could literally change human history. Is the U.S. military in possession of actual alien technology? On the new 4-part Change Agents special series Black Project, an Ironclad original, we examine the history of military research into anti-gravity, strange special access projects, and the work being done by private contractors like Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works to try to understand if UFOs are real, or if the military is hiding a breakthrough that could potentially alter our world. Stay tuned until the end for an exclusive first episode preview. Become an Ironclad YouTube member to binge all 4 episodes of Change Agents Black Project on launch day. Otherwise, catch new episodes weekly. Join now, YouTube at This Is Ironclad. Just out of curiosity, of all the things you could write about, what was it about particularly the agency or the intelligence apparatus or military industrial complex that sparked your interest?
Originally?
Yes. What got you kind of oriented in that direction?
I mean, every journalist that gets a lucky break should never forget that lucky break. And I am one of them. And this speaks exactly to your question. I was reporting on terrorism in the early 2000s. This is kind of like the, domestic, like DHS was brand new. You're talking about federal agents in a domestic environment. And I was at a dinner party, seated next to an old man, 88 years old, who I thought I knew he worked for Lockheed. And I thought he was I imagined him designing like windows for airplanes. And he leaned over to me and said, I've been reading your reporting and have I got a story for you? And, when you're a reporter, you're like, okay. And he said, the CIA just declassified 50 years worth of my life's work. And that makes your head spin. And it was, he was the physicist for the very secretive Lockheed Skunk Works, which created stealth technology for the CIA and the Pentagon starting in the 1950s at Area 51. And so how could you not have a sudden interest? I mean, that was like, you just lean in and say, wow, would you introduce me to your friends? And he did. And that built that first book I wrote, Area 51, which involved 74 people from the intelligence community and the military community that had actually lived and worked at that secret base that everyone thought was, had to do with aliens, and in fact was a testing facility for CIA spy planes.
Yeah, if somebody opened that door for me to have those conversations, I would be sprinting through that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was also just so remarkable because Well, first of all, Ed Lovick, that was the physicist. He was in his late 80s, and many of his friends were in their 90s. And we're talking about friends that, Ray Gowdy, who was a barnstormer in between the world wars, and a stunt pilot who actually flew some of the first U-2 flights out at 51. He was still alive and interviewed with me. And people like Hervey Stockman, the first man to fly the U-2 over the Soviet Union in the 50s. All these guys were World War II heroes who had been given this cushy job out at Area 51. And they were remarkable individuals. And they generously shared with me these secret programs because they had just been declassified. This was in 2009. They had just been declassified. And so they had been almost forgotten. And, their family members didn't necessarily want to hear about it, but I did.
I often wish that podcasting was a medium that existed more back then, or even around the time of World War II or the Korean War or even Vietnam War. I feel like there are, what you're describing, these people that if they hadn't been given the opportunity, the information largely would have died with them. Just the chance and the opportunity to record those stories would be, I'm glad you had those conversations, but I often wonder what it would have been like if you could have had a similar conversation like we're having now on this medium and transmit it. It would have been a great way to capture some of that history.
I wonder that same thing. And I always encourage people to, within their own families, because sometimes people say like, oh, my father or my grandfather did this, but I don't really know. And I always say, just get your iPhone, which has a better recording device, by the way, than I had as a young reporter. And I had all the best equipment, but
Yeah.
the iPhone recording device, you just hit the button and ask that old timer family member about their experiences and record them, because you're absolutely right. Especially as people get older, they recognize that when they die, their stories are going to go with them. And the opportunity to speak about it becomes a profound experience.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely want to talk with you a little bit about Area 51 and some of your other works, but I want to talk specifically right now about your most current book, the topic of which not exactly a happy, read this one staring at the sunset type of book. It's a subject matter that largely people would associate with the end of the world. I'm talking about nuclear war. How did that one get your attention? Why did you decide to write a book on this particular topic?
So imagine me writing before nuclear war. I'd written 6 books, all of which deal with some of the things we're talking about. And these, individuals who have fought in every war since World War II, operated under extreme duress in very violent environments, often paramilitary, because of course I've written books about the CIA's paramilitary, which is not the military. And often I would ask my sources, particularly when we would come to areas that some people might say are morally questionable, I would say, why did you do what you did? And a common answer was to prevent nuclear World War III. And every one of my books crosses with nuclear operations. And so in the first Trump administration, during those fire and fury rhetoric days, I wondered what would happen if prevention of nuclear World War III failed and we actually had a nuclear war. And when COVID happened, I, like many people around the world, found themselves with a little extra time and a Zoom platform, which really, did not exist before. And someone that I was working with suggested to me that the generals, the nuclear command and control folks, might have a little more time for me than they normally would. And that is precisely what happened. And so the sources that I have in nuclear war scenario, which for readers to know, I list right up front in the book, as opposed to the standard way of journalism, you list your sources in the back. I wanted readers to know how deeply sourced this book was, how I spoke to individuals like former secretaries of defense, former commander of Stratcom, of the nuclear submarine forces, Obama's FEMA director, Obama's top nuclear advisor. I wanted people to realize that although I was writing a scenario, I had learned through these interviews during COVID what would happen if deterrence failed. And that is the result of the book.
Ladies and gentlemen, hot salt from Firecracker Farm is the real deal. It's not just heat, it's flavor that elevates everything that you cook. The best thing to happen to food since fire. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to go ahead and agree with that. It's delightful. One of the best things about this brand is there's a real person behind it. His name is Alex, and he makes these in small batches, so it's not always easy to get. You don't want to miss out. All of the flavors are great. I have tried all of them. You really can't go wrong. Seriously, try it on everything. Steaks, vegetables, everything in between. If you like milder heat, mix in some sea salt to dilute it. This is a choose your own adventure. You can go direct from the push button dispenser, or you can dilute to hit that flavor profile that you're looking for. The best way that you can help this show is to help Alex and his small family business by grabbing some hot salt and trying it for yourself. So go to Firecracker Farm and use the code Ironclad for 15% off of your first order. Alex would also like me to thank you, the audience, for giving his small business a shot. I'm telling you right now, head over to Firecracker Farm, pick something out. I honestly don't think that you can go wrong. It's an amazing product founded by a very cool person. The backstory behind it is legit, and it's going to make your food taste better. So some talk recently about potential worry of World War III or nuclear war escalating. I've heard around Ukraine specifically, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Let's say Russia were to crumble or were to faction, it would be possible to have states or nation states that then had access to nuclear arms. And I think it's almost impossible for people to imagine what the world would look like if it actually escalated to that level. And I'm curious, in your research, in your conversations with these people, what kind of picture did they paint? I mean, what did they think about what it would potentially look like in the scenario that we did, in fact, escalate? Prevention's failed, and it does happen, whether it's between the U.S. nation states or even, non-nation states to somehow get access to these nuclear arms.
In nuclear war scenario, I take the reader from nuclear launch to nuclear winter. And it happens very fast, and it is a ticking time clock scenario. And the reason I did that stemmed from an interview I did with the U.S. commander of Stratcom. And Stratcom, for listeners who don't know, U.S. Strategic Command. The commander is the steward of all nuclear weapons and all nuclear weapon systems. In the event of a nuclear counterstrike that the president needed to make, he speaks directly with the Stratcom commander. There is no one between them, no one. And when I was speaking to retired General Keeler, I asked him in the course of our interview what would happen in a full-scale nuclear exchange with Russia. And he said to me, Annie, the world would end in the next couple of hours. And that I knew, in that moment, I knew I had the book. I knew that was coming from that person was not something that should ever be taken lightly. And by the way, Stratcom commanders don't generally talk to journalists.
That sounds reasonable. I can imagine they're not looking for a lot of press.
And I understood the existential threat. So I began to source the book around, working from that quote. What I also was stunned to learn from Andrew Weber, who was the top-ranking nuclear advisor to several presidents, that a bolt out of the blue attack is what Washington fears most. And that's a single weapon, as you mentioned, rogue or otherwise, coming at Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
And so I took those two and a lot of other sources and interviews that I did to demonstrate what would happen, how when nuclear war begins, it only ends in nuclear Armageddon. And this is something we know from one of the very rare nuclear war games that has been declassified by the Pentagon. So they do hundreds of them a year, believe it or not, and they're all incredibly classified. But one has been declassified. I reprint a page of it in the book, and readers sometimes say to me, why did you print this? You look at it and it's just all black. And there's one word in that reprint and it says scenario. That's all the government wants you to know. This is a scenario and you can't know what happens. And I show you what happens. But you may say, well, why print that? Well, in declassifying that one war game, it's called Proud Prophet and it's from the 80s. In declassifying that, the individuals involved in that wargaming scenario, it was 2 weeks long, were able to speak generally about nuclear war scenarios without defying their security clearance. And so, for example, a professor from Yale named Paul Bracken, who worked on that program, was able to share generally about what happens in a nuclear war game. And he's the one who told us, no matter how nuclear war begins, whether NATO is involved, whether China is involved, whether they're not involved, no matter how it begins, it only ends in nuclear Armageddon. And Bracken said that all the individuals, all the nuclear command and control people involved in that war game left very depressed.
Is the Armageddon, and I mean, it sounds like a species destroying, if not a world destroying event. I mean, obviously there's the proximity, and actually this is a good question for you too. I'm curious, the modern lexicon, Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer project has been kind of pulled back in due to the movie, not saying that it's a nonfiction movie, but it brought that type, the Manhattan Project, back into people's minds. But that was atomic. Can you explain, and actually one of the most shocking things about that movie for me is the math was pretty certain, but not 100% concrete that they were not going to ignite the atmosphere when they cooked that thing off, which is not something that I was aware of. So that, they were pretty sure on their numbers, but the numbers didn't show with absolute certainty. And again, that was an atomic bomb. Could you describe the difference between an atomic bomb and a nuclear bomb from just size and scope and scale?
So the nuclear weapons would be what we would consider today. The atomic weapons would be what we would maybe call today tactical weapons. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons and Nagasaki was 21 kilotons. The thermonuclear bombs measure in the megatons. And it's almost impossible for the human mind to understand that scale of magnitude. For the book, I interviewed the man who wrote the architectural plans for the very first thermonuclear bomb ever exploded. We did a weapons test in the Pacific called the Ivy Mike thermonuclear test. It was 10.4 megatons. And the designer's name was Richard Garwin. People often think of Edward Teller as the father of the thermonuclear bomb, Oppenheimer being the father of the atomic bomb. But actually, Edward Teller couldn't figure out how to make the thermonuclear weapon explode. He could only imagine it theoretically. And so this 24-year-old kid named Richard Garwin, a student of Enrico Fermi, is the one who was able to make that bomb explode. And Garwin, now in his 90s, I interviewed at length with him in the book, and he explained it to me. And one of the incredible things about talking to sort of the Superman of science is that they understand science at such a profound level. The rest of us cannot compete and should not compete, but they all adhere. And I'm talking about the smartest guys in the room now. They adhere to what I call the Einstein principle, that you can explain something to a second grader if you really understand it. And I explain the power of the thermonuclear bomb in my book, the way Garwin explained it to me, and I encourage people to read it, but I'll give you a short version of it. He said to me, Annie, the best way to understand the power of the thermonuclear is that it's a two-stage weapon that uses an atomic bomb inside of itself as a fuse, as a triggering device. Consider that when you want to understand the power of the megaton thermonuclears.
That is a pretty impressive visual, because most people can picture the mushroom cloud from Nagasaki or Hiroshima. And if that is the fuse that is kicking off the other device, okay, now I'm understanding a little bit more nuclear Armageddon. So essentially, and this is more of a question, but an assumption on my part, in talking with these individuals that were responsible from these weapons, it is the end of our species if any country, or if there were to be an exchange of any kind.
Well, everything escalates, and it escalates because of misunderstandings and miscalculations. And everyone at the Pentagon knows that. I mean, everyone. And so I demonstrate how that happens in the book. You have all kinds of problems. I mean, I'll give you one example. You know, we have a satellite system in space that recognizes the launch of an enemy nuclear weapon in the first fraction of a second. You did not mishear me speak. The first fraction of a second. Satellite systems, they're built by Lockheed. They're called the SBIRS systems. They are parked over nuclear armed nations looking for launches 24/7, 365 days a year. And so nuclear war begins in the first second after launch. Our Defense Department knows that launch happens and is calculating the trajectory. If that launch is going to hit the United States, they know that in under several minutes, around 150 seconds after launch is when the Defense Department knows that is coming for the continental United States. And that is where nuclear war begins, because the United States has a policy called launch on warning. It's exactly like it sounds. We launch on warning. We do not wait to absorb a nuclear blow. If someone is crazy enough to launch a nuclear weapon, a strategic nuclear weapon inside of an ICBM at the United States that will get here in under 30 minutes, we launch. And from there, everything
There's no coming back. Yeah, there's no coming back from that. Is there an estimate on how many nuclear bombs are currently in existence?
Oh, there's not an estimate. There's a precise accounting of that. And for that, we thank the Federation of American Scientists. They have a division inside of themselves called the Nuclear Notebook, which is run by Hans Christensen and his team. And if anyone's interested, they can go to the Nuclear Notebook and learn exactly the number of weapons that are online. There are those that have ready for launch status, and I simplify them down in my book, and I can tell you any of the numbers, but the real sort of homework comes from the Federation of American Science Project. And I like to say that because without that, so many of us would be in the dark, guessing and speculating. Now, there is lots of speculation in terms of certain nuclear programs. For example, you know, Israel pretends not to have a nuclear program. We don't know exactly their numbers because they don't make them transparent. Pakistan, India, we're not sure. The different nuclear armed nations that adhere to the nuclear treaties adhere to a level of transparency, in which those countries report their nuclear weapons and their nuclear weapon systems. And that includes Russia, that includes the United States, France, UK, etc. I get a little nerdy on that stuff, but it's important because your question is incredibly valuable. These are not guesstimates. And let me tell you the shocking number just to really upset you, okay, which is that the United States has on ready for launch status 1,770 nuclear weapons. Russia has on ready for launch status 1,600 and 64. So about the same. And those numbers change a little bit every year, but that gives you an idea. And when I say ready for launch status, 400 of the US ICBMs, all 400 of them, can launch in as little as 60 seconds from the president's order.
Wow.
And now you begin to see why, once it begins, it doesn't stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to get into elite shape, or perhaps just make improvements to your current level of fitness, check out the MTNTOUGH digital training program. You can try it for free for 14 days, and you can see the results for yourself. The app allows users to train wherever they are with minimal equipment requirements, whether you're in the gym or you're outdoors or you're at home. Users can access top-tier programming that fits into their lifestyle. The MTNTOUGH app offers expertly designed progressive training plans that guide users from start to finish. These plans are tailored to build resilience, strength, and endurance over time, preventing burnout and injury. The app features self-guided and follow-along coaching videos, allowing users to be coached through every workout step by step. This helps to ensure proper form, motivation, and intensity, regardless of the user's fitness level. The MTNTOUGH app delivers training programs built for the unique physical demands of mountain athletes, including hunters, tactical professionals, and outdoor adventurers. The programs themselves are designed by seasoned strength and conditioning experts, elite athletes, and military veterans. Start your 14-day free trial today and check out the results for yourself. And be sure to use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS, and I'm looking at it as one word, at signup, and you can get 40% off your annual subscription. Remember, use the offer code CHANGEAGENTS at checkout. In talking with the people that were directly associated with the stewardship of these weapons, were they able to give you any indication or assessment of how close we've actually come to that line in the past?
So again, a lot of that is on the record, and I report a couple of open source stories that have been reported in other books because they're really shocking. I won't. I mean, they're very interesting, and read the book, and there's maybe 8 or 10 of them. But imagine the stories that we don't know about. Imagine the near misses. And this points to a quote by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres that I find chilling, which is that he said, "The world is one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation."
Whew. That's a heavy thought process going into the weekend.
Well, but here's the upside, and I really mean that, which is that, one of my favorite sayings is you can't fix what you can't face.
Yeah.
But you can fix what you are willing to face. It's true as an individual, it's true in your family, it's true in your nation, it's true in the world. And nuclear war scenario has been widely received around the world. It's publishing in 28 countries. But not only that, it's been embraced by, for example, last week I was at the United Nations. I'd been asked to come talk about my book. And there are, people that very seriously work on this issue. It is called nuclear non-proliferation. It is this idea that not only can the world not afford to have more nuclear weapons, but we must continue to disarm. President Trump calls it denuclearization. And, I am not a political writer. No one knows what my politics are. And that allows me to communicate and work with a lot of people who I think exist way above tribal politics. They exist in the realm of trying to actually prevent nuclear World War III. And so that is hopeful because it's kind of all this work going on behind the veil. But at the same time, it gets attention. It gets, world leaders pay attention to things that their constituents care about. And so when you have people demanding change, like people did in the 1980s, which got Ronald Reagan to enter into the treaties with Gorbachev that got us on the right path towards denuclearization, disarmament. You need people to become vocal about the fact that this is something that they want. They want less nuclear weapons, not more. And we're at this very precarious time when you have countries like Poland saying, or Ukraine even, oh, maybe we should have nuclear weapons. If you are me and you have written Nuclear War a Scenario, or if you're a reader and has read it, you might say, you know what? That's actually not the solution. That is going to make the world more dangerous.
Yeah. I'm curious. With your access and ability to talk to these people who were in such close proximity to responsible for these weapons and understanding exactly of what would happen if they were to launch, do you find a sentiment that regardless of how they may have felt before entering into that role, they are now much more in support of a non-proliferation approach?
Well, by all means, I have learned in my reporting over the past 20 years, working with sources because for the most part, my sources are retired
Mhm.
CIA officers, retired generals. And that generally means they are older because people that reach, the upper echelons of power tend to work well on into their career because they're very good at what they do. And so by the time they retire, they're in their late 70s or 80s, and in many cases, 90s. And so by the time they are talking to a journalist like me, they have an opportunity to reflect. They understand they are in the final act of their life. And as many of them have said to me, I'm a grandfather now. And so this raises an interesting paradox, which I think you're hinting at, which is, what do people in the later stages of their life think about when they were younger men? And do they wonder if they would have done it differently? And that is a question I almost always ask. And in general, the answers, and I quote people directly, but the answers tend to be more subtle.
Hmm.
And I think they allow us to read between the lines because you have people who are dedicated civil servants or military officers. And maybe this loops us back to that original question you asked me, like, do I have faith in the government? Do I have faith in democracy? American democracy. And that is why my answer is yes, because so many of the individuals I spoke to, even though they reflect and maybe there's a sense of I could have done it differently, what they are in essence saying by going on the record with me, and again, this is my interpretation, which is take my story and learn from it.
Yeah, there definitely is. I think it's true for everybody. I mean, as you grow and have experience and your life changes. I mean, I remember being 20. I thought that 30 was as old as a human being gets. And I never thought about having children. And
Mhm.
now I'm into my late 40s and my oldest son is 21 going on 22. And I
Mhm.
remember what I thought about what military service would be like. I remember thinking about what direct exposure to combat would be like. And I often find the people that have been around a good amount of violence, they're changed by it most often, and they have no desire for exposure to that anymore, or for anybody else to be exposed to it.
Mhm.
And that was kind of the origin of that question about those directly responsible for these weapons, knowing what it could cause. It wouldn't surprise me at all as if later in life they had a shift or a different mentality and
Mhm.
firmly landed on a place where they would never want to see them used. Not that they wanted to see them used while they were in the steward of those, but and perhaps even maybe reducing the nuclear arsenal. Which, do you think that that's even possible? Do you think it's ever possible for us to get to a non-nuclear world?
Mhm. Okay, so I'm going to answer that question, but first I'm going to tell you one interesting coda to the this, which is that I asked Richard Garwin. So Richard Garwin is that individual, the physicist who drew the plans for the Ivy Mike bomb, the first thermonuclear, and has advised every president since. I asked him if he regretted what he did. And after a long pause, he said to me, I wish it couldn't have been done.
Oh, interesting.
And what he was saying, and I think about this often, is what he was saying is, if I hadn't done it, someone else would have. I mean, and that's really something to think about when you write about science and technology and war and weapons, as I do. And also, by the way, we know now that the Russians were on the path of designing a thermonuclear weapon and did just a few months after we did. And so you have this real complex catch-22 about science and about technology. But there was a second part of your question, which I wanted to answer, which was interesting. Do you remember what?
I was just wondering if you think it's ever possible, given where we are in 2025, to arrive at a non-nuclear world.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, all right. So another hopeful story. In the 80s, in 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. 70,000. Today, we have approximately 12,300.
All right. We're making improvements.
So how did we get there? Well, Ronald Reagan was a hawk when he took office. He was working on Star Wars, the strategic defense initiative that put weapons into space. But he watched a television movie called The Day After, which envisioned, it was an ABC TV movie, and it envisioned nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And he watched that movie, and his chief of staff, by the way, did not want him to watch it, but he did. And he wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed. But as a result, he reached out to Gorbachev, and he became willing to see the enemy. And keep in mind, in 1983, when that movie came out, the Soviet Union was the twirling mustache bad guy. They were really the arch enemy.
This is the Red Dawn movie era.
Yes.
They're invading. Yes.
I mean, and so the fact that Reagan could see Gorbachev as the adversary, not the enemy. You want to kill the enemy, and you want to the adversary is different. You might work with them. And that's what he did. And that is why the world went from 70,000 nuclear weapons in 1986 to where we are today. And the two of them almost signed this treaty that made, that to essentially get rid of all nuclear weapons. It's called Global Zero in the sort of, disarmament world. Do I think we can get there? Well, what I do know is there's a treaty at the United Nations called the TPNW, the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons. And it's signed by a majority of the 193 nations of the UN. A majority of them. But not the nuclear-armed nations who still want to keep their arsenals. But when you have a majority of nations, that's half the nations. It kind of goes back to that question we were discussing earlier, which is the people are speaking. They are saying we don't want these weapons. We don't want so many of them. If you read my book, you realize if nuclear war begins, it ends in annihilation. And so, 70,000 nuclear weapons, my God. 12,300, we're doing better. If you look in an ideal world, global zero, certainly for the disarmament folks, but how about moving toward it?
Yeah.
And that seems very realistic and very practical to me. And again, politics having nothing to do with my reporting, I am certainly optimistic about the current president speaking about denuclearization, speaking about his previous conversations, which many of us didn't even know about, with China and Russia, about the possibility of reducing arsenals. That is a profound step in the right direction.
I agree. Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that people like that and initiatives like that exist for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to lateral gears on here a little bit, but this falls directly into your reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I need you to tell me about all the aliens that are being held at Area 51.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're the one who knows. You have to tell me the secret.
I mean, I write in the end of Area 51, I discuss that deception campaign in the last 12 pages of my book. And people just went so berserk. It's part of why I think the book became such a bestseller, because I even had the alien people saying, that's too dark. And I'm not going to give it away. You have to go read Area 51. But my source in that book was a nuclear weapons engineer. And while he gave me permission to tell his whole story after he died, and I still haven't done that, I did discuss him and his work on the Lex Friedman podcast that I did when Nuclear War came out, because it's a very interesting thread, this mix of deception campaigns to prevent nuclear World War III and the actual development of thermonuclear weapons. And I don't mean to be cryptic, but at the same time,
no, I can see the breadcrumbs on that.
Yeah, and I also hope people will understand, when you're me, like I sometimes, that individual, for example, his name was Al O'Donnell, and he was a member of the Manhattan Project. He wired the very first nuclear bomb after the war. It was called the Crossroads Test, and I write about it in Nuclear War, and I write about it in several of my books. It happened in 1946 in the Marshall Islands, and he became a weapons engineer for EG&G and wired. They called him the Trigger Man because he wired something like 183 nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
And many of my sources I spend, he's an example, 100 or more hours with, to write a few pages of their story. And so I hope readers can recognize that the density of what I write about, meaning I can condense a very long amount of reporting into a few pages. And so the pages are packed with information, but they are set up by chapters before and chapters after. And some subjects feel so significant in modern national security history that they're not things I talk about glibly, in an interview. I just demand readers read it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, and that's totally fair. Area 51 to me is an interesting one. It has, obviously, it's associated with UFO lore. I know that you wrote about it directly. Can you briefly, for the listeners, describe what Area 51 was originally designed for, and then when the UFO lore kind of got attached to it? Because I find it to be an interesting confluence of military, civilian, engineering, all of that kind of coming together.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no doubt that, the end of World War II, how it ended, was an absolute turning point in modern American history, in humanity, and also in weapons technology. And Area 51 began just a few years later, in the earliest days of the atomic age, Area 51 is a classified military base inside of a classified nuclear testing range called the Nevada Test Site. The name has changed. I still call it the Nevada Test Site. Inside a classified facility called the the Nevada Test and Training Range. It's a massive piece of land, and it was the perfect place for the CIA to set up a base to build spy planes that could spy on the Soviet Union from overhead, very specifically to figure out what the Soviets were up to and whether they were going to start nuclear World War III. And I write the origin story from the people who were there. That is what is so remarkable about Area 51, with all this time having passed. And I am like just the privileged reporter that got access to it. And I'm so glad I did. And I'm so glad all those men told me their stories before they died. And I put it in the book. But you are absolutely right that it's kind of the nexus of this modern way of war, which spilled out from there. And all of my books follow that through line. The Operation Paperclip, in which I write about the Nazi scientists who came here after the war to build our weapon systems so we could make sure we outperformed the Soviets. The DARPA book I wrote called The Pentagon's Brain. DARPA is the most secret science agency in the military that, almost nobody knows about. It was built, it came immediately out of this need to create vast weapon systems of the future. As we were doing it, the Soviets were doing it too. And so and then you have the CIA's paramilitary operations trying to figure out what's happening on the ground with the small wars. And so my experience as a reporter over the past 20 years and working on all these books has been weaving together the different military and intelligence community operations that make the fabric of the modern world.
Given we're talking 1960s at this location, we're talking things like SR-71, the U-2 spy plane. Both of those designs, by the way, they still hold water. Those aircraft are unbelievable. SR-71 not flying anymore, U-2, and then there's Lockheed A-12, super high altitude planes, Mach speeds. This is 60s technologies.
Yep. And for reader or listeners who don't know, we'll just say, if they saw the X-Men movies, the plane those superheroes fly is essentially the SR-71, which we know now was actually the Air Force unclassified version of the super secret CIA plane that was the originator of that, called the A-12 Oxcart, which was a one-seater, and the pilots of whom I interviewed for the Area 51 book.
Unbelievable. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
What a life story. But, so given, again, we're talking, it's 2025, 1960s. That is 65 years ago. And the designs, I mean, they're not exactly cutting edge, but beyond what was probably thought to be possible at the time. And given this nexus of civilian, we have things like Lockheed Skunk Works, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, the U.S. military working there as well. UAP conversations are pretty prominent now in just the modern lexicon and vernacular. You're going to hear people talking about it over coffee, whereas 20 years ago, you might have thought that was the crazy person in the corner. Now it's a pretty common thing, people talking about UAPs. If they were able to create, those entities were able to create something that sophisticated and complex beyond what we thought possible back in the 60s, just your personal opinion, what do you think the likelihood is that most of what we hear associated with the UAP may well just be projects that are being worked on, not necessarily at that facility, but facilities wherever they may be, just beyond what we think is possible? I mean, I just try to think about this as a person. If they would have thought it was impossible then, why wouldn't they be able to create things that we think are impossible now? I'm just curious your thoughts, given how much time you spent looking in that sector.
So I am the person who wrote some of the most original revelations about what happened at Area 51 with UAP deception campaigns. They were called UFO deception campaigns. And I say that I will give you this as an example. When those planes were flying, for example, the U-2 flew at 70,000 feet. And this is in the 50s, not the 60s. And people who are not familiar with the U-2, it essentially looked like a flying cross because the wingspan is so wide. And before they were painted black, they were silver, and they would reflect the sun. And so there was no such thing as an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet. A commercial aircraft flies at like 25,000 feet at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So of course people saw this, and I show documents I've looked at and cite documents in my book that people call up their congressman convinced they saw a UFO because that's exactly what it looked like. And then I also have seen documents and report about them of the CIA's UFO office out at Area 51, where they realize this is terrific. People think it's a UFO. Better that than having our program revealed to the Soviets. Now, does that mean every UFO sighting in the history of mankind is a U-2 spy plane? Of course not. Of course not. But it raises the question that you are raising about what a deception campaign actually is.
Yeah. What would be your best guess? What kind of technology do you think that they're working on? Things that would just blow our minds?
Well, of course. I mean, there are that's the DARPA book I wrote, which is, DARPA's job is to create the vast weapon systems of the future. They work on programs that are 25 years ahead of what we see. And they don't necessarily reveal them until they have to. The F-117 fighter jet, that program was, no one knew about it for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So you have to, again, does that mean everything is unclassified? Of course not, or not known. But I personally, listen, people love to talk about UAPs and, Tic Tacs, and I get it.
I want them to be real. If I'm being honest, I would like to meet the Green Man. Let's go have a coffee or a beer. I think if you are out there, you probably could have destroyed us. Let's just talk. Let's get along.
I just happen to find the actual things that human beings do and keep secret so much more interesting than the fantasy part of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
It is if you read my book, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, about the CIA's paramilitary operations, you can't believe what people are capable of. At least I can't. I like writing about high technology programs, but also human programs, like where people do things that involve such courage and strange, combination of physical prowess and intellectual capacity that's beyond and sort of daring, that is, leave out the morality of it, the moral judgments of it, rather, because again, everyone's doing what they're doing at the behest of the president. But those operations are just stunning to me in terms of what human beings are capable of and will actually do in the name of national security.
Yeah, I'm peripherally familiar and have a few people, friends that have worked in that world, and it is an occupation that few would understand the demands, for sure.
And it also just, if you're me, a reporter, and again, I spend a lot of time with, sometimes like with Billy Waugh, I traveled with him to places he operated around the world, like Cuba and Hanoi, because I wanted to hear firsthand his experiences. And he would, sometimes those memories would come back to him when we were traveling internationally. But I am very interested in the capacity of the human being and the extremes that some people go to. And also keep in mind that I never forget that many of the people I work with are acutely aware that all of their friends died and they survived. And that kind of a person has, I think, a lot to offer the rest of us if they are a thoughtful person, as the sources that I'm interested in reporting on, prove to actually be.
Yeah. Yeah, I can agree with that. Two more questions for you today, Annie. First, what do you think, out of everything that you have encountered, what do you think would surprise the American people the most when it comes to technology being developed by private aerospace companies for use, military purpose, or that nexus coming together? Is there anything that stands out you think would shock people the most?
I mean, there's so many examples. I'm going to flip it back to a reverse concept, right? Which is, what always surprises me is as technology advances so radically, some things remain the same. And that's usually what really interests me.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example that the ICBM, which was developed in the 50s by the Nazi scientists, by the way, essentially is the same technology that it was then. And this is the weapon system that will bring about nuclear Armageddon. This is the weapon system, the ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missile, that can get from a launch pad in Moscow to the United States in 26 minutes and 40 seconds. This is technology that cannot be redirected or recalled. And so when I think about sort of an analog systems, and I mean that metaphorically, but also literally, and I think about advanced technology systems, it just always brings me right back to like the mystery of being human, you know? And then I tell people to just go watch Chimp Empire and,
It's a great
really,
show. It's a great show.
right? And just go like, somebody once said to me the other day, what's the origin story of Ground Branch? Ground Branch is, of course, the CIA's paramilitary organization. And I said, Chimp Empire.
It's not a bad answer, actually. Well, okay. Final question for you today. What's your next book? I feel like you have a couple lined up, but do you have like a top 3 racked and stacked? What are you going to be looking at next?
Oh, I'm deep into it, and it's gonna, it'll publish next year, but I will not say.
Okay.
Because the mystery for the big reveal should be there. But what I can say is that you could almost see it as part 2 of Nuclear War.
Fair enough. I like leaving the viewers with a little cliffhanger there. Anything else you would like to close out with? I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're coming to the end of it, and I really appreciate your insight so far. So any closing thoughts for the audience?
I just loved being on your podcast. Thank you for having me.
On the debut episode of Black Project, a Change Agents special series, we examine the strange, true story of the military's efforts to build anti-gravitic craft. From a Nazi weapon expert's fake death and cryptic comments by aerospace executives, to the mysterious disappearance of a scientist on the edge of a breakthrough, we look at the programs being worked on in secret and the question of whether they are from another planet, or are they the results of black projects you were never supposed to know about. Become an Ironclad YouTube member to binge all 4 episodes of Change Agents Black Project on launch day. Otherwise, catch new episodes weekly. Join now, YouTube @This Is Ironclad.